Hey guys, remember to like the video and hit subscribe.
Can you define the ideals and the vision of the American left?
Oh, good. We're starting small here.
And maybe contrast them with the American right.
Sure. So the thing I should say.
Hi, family Ukraine. Their city is getting messed up right now. As an American, do you have any advice for me when they tell me they feel hopeless, betrayed, and abandoned by the U.S. as your president favors Russia? Nope. Tell them to leave. Move. I don't know. Good luck.
Here is that you can define the left in different ways. I think the left has a couple fundamental views. One is that life is unfair. We are born with different talents. We are born into different nations, right? The luck of being born into America is very different than the luck of being born into Venezuela. We are born into different families. We have luck operating as an omnipresence across our entire lives. And as such, the people for whom it works out well, we don't deserve all of that. We got lucky. I mean, we also worked hard and we also had talent and we also applied that talent. But at a very fundamental level, that we are sitting here is unfair. And that so many other people are in conditions that are much worse, much more precarious, much more exploited is unfair. And one of the fundamental roles of government should not necessarily be to turn that unfairness into perfect equality, but to rectify that unfairness into a kind of universal dignity, right? So people can have lives of flourishing. So I'd say that's one thing. The left is fundamentally more skeptical of capitalism and particularly unchecked forms of capitalism than the right. I always think this is hard to talk about because what we call unchecked capitalism is nevertheless very much supported by government. So I think in a way, you have both. Like markets are things that are enforced by government. Whether they are, how you set the rules of them is what ends up differing between the left and the right. But the left tends to be more worried about the fact that you could get rich building coal-fired power plants, belching pollution into the air, and you could get rich laying down solar panels, and the market doesn't know the difference between the two. And so there's a set of goals about regulating the unchecked potential of capitalism that also relates to sort of exploitation of workers. There's like very fundamental questions about how much people get paid, how much power they have. Again, the rectification of economic and other forms of power is very fundamental to the left. When you think about what the minimum wage is, I am a successful podcast host. When I go into a negotiation with the New York Times, I have a certain amount of market power in that negotiation because other firms want to hire me. When you are a minimum wage worker, the reason we have a minimum wage is in part to rectify a power problem. A lot of workers do not have market power. They do not have a bunch of job opportunities. They're not working with firms. And by the way, without certain kinds of regulation, those firms will cartelize and make it so they can hold down wages anyway. So trying to rectify power imbalances is, I think, another thing folks on the left take more seriously. That would be a start of things that I think broadly unite maybe let's call it the intuitions. I want to say that's a podcast answer, not a book. I'm sure I left a million things out here, but I'll start there.
I mean, there's a lot of fascinating things there on the unfairness of life. That could be the interperson unfairness. So one person getting more money than another person, more skills or more natural abilities than another person. And then there's just the general unfairness of the environment, the luck of the draw, the things that happen. All of a sudden you cross a street and the car runs a red light and runs you over and you're in the hospital. So that unfairness of life. And in general, I guess the left sees there's some role or a lot of role for government to help you when that unfairness strikes. And then maybe there's also a general notion of the size of government. I think the left is more comfortable with larger government as long as it's effective and efficient, at least in its idea.
That's certainly true in the last 100 years. It was New Deal liberals who enlarged the government in the 1930s. It was Republicans who acquiesced to that larger government in the 1950s. And then starting in the 1970s, 1980s, it's typically been conservatives who've tried to constrict government. Sometimes they failed, while liberals have typically tried to expand, certainly taxing and spending. But one thing that I was thinking as Ezra was talking, and I was just writing this down because I thought Ezra's answer was really lovely, but like at a really high level, I thought, maybe disagree with this. I thought about distinguishing between liberals and conservatives based on three factors: what each side fears, what each side values, and what each side tolerates. I think liberals fear injustice, and conservatives often fear cultural radicalism or the destruction of society. And as a result, they value different things. Liberals, I think, tend to value change. And at the level of government, that can mean change in terms of creating new programs that don't previously exist. It's typically been liberals, for example, who've been trying to expand health coverage, while conservatives have tried to cut it back. Just in the last few years, it was Biden who tried to add a bunch of programs, whether it was infrastructure, the Chips and Science Act, the IRA, and then Trump comes into office and is unwinding it. And then I also think they tolerate different things. I think liberals are more likely to tolerate a little bit of overreach, a little bit of radicalism in terms of trying to push society into a world where it hasn't been. While I think conservatives are more likely to tolerate injustice. They're more likely to say there's a kind of natural inequality in the nature of the world, and we're not going to try to overcorrect for it with our policies.
I'm done.
And so I think that even at a layer
Yeah.
above what Ezra was articulating with the policy differences between liberals and conservatives, there's almost like an archetypal difference between what they fear and value and tolerate. Liberals fearing injustice, seeking change, tolerating sometimes a bit of what people might think of as overreach, while conservatives fear that overreach, value tradition, and often tolerate injustice.
The only thing I would say is that I do think this sort of the left likes big government, the right likes small government oversimplifies.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the issues, I'm sure they'll get into it because it's a long show, is you run into an issue of those concepts that I talk about, those tricky, sneaky concepts, where I don't like speaking only on a conceptual level without giving examples. Although, to be fair, the other guy did give examples, which is nice. But Ezra's probably about to say it. When you talk about like big government, in some ways, you know, the conservatives do like big government. In some ways, liberals do like small government. Sometimes it depends on the issue that you're talking about. So you have to get a bit more granular there about what it is you're discussing when you say government overreach or whatever the f else. But
the left is pretty comfortable with an expansive government that is trying to correct for some of the imbalances of power and injustices and imbalances of luck I talked about earlier. The right is very comfortable with a very powerful police and surveillance and national security state. I always think about the sort of George W. Bush era, although right now with ICE agents hassling all kinds of green card holders, you can think about this moment too. But the right's view that on the one hand, the government is incompetent, and on the other hand,
it's impossible. Like that can't be a fundamental axiom that they don't trust big government, or that they don't trust. What are you doing? Chill. Like they'll say things like they don't trust the FBI, they don't trust the CIA, they don't trust all these federal bodies. But whoo-wee, when it comes to the FBI working with ICE, when it comes to the Department of Homeland Security and immigrants or deporting immigrants, now all of a sudden these agencies are gods. You know,
we could send our army across oceans, invade Afghanistan and Iraq, and then rebuild these societies we don't understand into fully functioning liberal democracies that will be our allies, was an extraordinary level of trust in a very big government. I mean, that was expensive. That took manpower. That was, compared to we're going to set up, you know, the Affordable Care Act in America, that took a lot more faith in the U.S. government being able to do something that was extraordinarily difficult. But the left has more confidence in the government of the check, and the right has more confidence in the government of the gun.
You're right. There's some degree to which when the right speaks about the size of government, it's a little bit rhetoric and not actual policy, because they seem to always grow the size of government.
that's not at all what he said, but okay.
Anyway, they just kind of say small government, but they don't. It's, you know, in the surveillance state, in the foreign policy in terms of military involvement abroad, and really in every program, they're not very good at cutting either. They just kind of like to say it.
Cutting is really hard. Government spends trillions of dollars, and if you cut billions of dollars, someone is going to feel that pain and they're going to scream. And so you look at defense spending under Reagan, you look at overall spending under Reagan. Reagan might be one of the most archetypally conservative presidents of the last 40, 50 years. He utterly failed in his attempt to shrink government. Government grew under Reagan. Defense grew, all sorts of programs grew. So I think that one thing we're sort of scrambling around in our answers is that at a really high level, there are differences between liberalism and conservatism in American history. But often at the level of implementation, it can be a little bit messy. Even Bush's foreign policy that Ezra was describing, sort of from a big sense of American history, is very like Wilsonian, right? This sense of like it's America's duty to go out and change the world.
Or to use a current example, McKinleyan.
Or McKinleyan, right. And a lot of people compare Donald Trump's foreign policy to Andrew Jackson, this sense of we need to pull back from the world, America first, we need to care about what's inside of our borders and care much less about what's outside of our borders.
You're going out.
Sometimes the differences between Republican and Democratic administrations don't fall cleanly into the lines of liberal versus conservative because those definitions can be mushy.
All right, so to descend down from the platonic ideals of the left and the right, well, who is actually running the show on the right and the left? Who are the dominant forces? Maybe you could describe, and you mentioned democratic socialists, the progressives, maybe liberals, maybe more sort of mainstream left, and the same on the right with Trump and Trumpism.
So on the right, it's pretty straightforward at the moment. And the right is composed differently than it was 10 years ago. But the right is run by Donald Trump and the people who have been given the nod of power by Donald Trump.
Yep.
So that is right now Elon Musk, but Elon Musk's power is coming from Donald Trump.
Yep.
That is, you know, maybe in some degrees J.D. Vance, maybe in some degrees Russ Vought, maybe sometimes, Homans over at DHS. The right, beneath that, the Republicans in Congress are extraordinarily disempowered compared to in other administrations. They are sort of being told what to do, and they are doing what they are told. Republicans in Congress, Senate Republicans, they didn't want Pete Hegseth. They didn't want Kash Patel. They didn't want Tulsi Gabbard. They didn't want RFK Jr. Nobody got elected to be a Republican in the Senate, hoping that they would confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a member of the Kennedys, a Democrat who was pro-choice and running as a Democrat 2 years ago, for HHS. But Donald Trump told them to do it, and they did. So the right has developed a very, very top-down structure. And one of Trump's talents, one of the things that makes him a disruptive force in politics, is his ability to upend the sort of coalitional structure, the interest group structure that used to prevail. The Koch brothers were the big enemy of the left, 10, 15 years ago. The view was that in many ways they set the agenda of the right. The Koch brother network is much less powerful under Donald Trump because he just disagrees with them and has disempowered them. Not to say none of their people or none of their groups are meaningful at all. They are, but you wouldn't put them at the forefront in the way that you might have at another time. Right this second, we're using the left, but Democrats are in fundamental disarray. There is no leader. Senate Democrats decided to vote for the continuing resolution avoiding a shutdown, or a critical mass of them did. Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the House Democrats, and Chuck Schumer, the leader of Senate Democrats, are in bitter disagreement over whether or not they should have done that. Democratic leadership isn't even united on the single biggest point of leverage they might have had. They disagree over whether or not it was even a point of leverage. Outside of them, the party has no leader, which is fairly normal after a pretty crushing defeat. But there isn't the next in line. So you go back, right? And it was pretty clear that, after Barack Obama, it was going to be Hillary Clinton. After Hillary Clinton, it was either going to be Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders had come in second in the primary. Joe Biden had been the vice president. You often have a presumptive next nominee who the party can look to for a kind of leadership. Even after 2000, Al Gore was still giving big speeches. There was a question about Al Gore running again. There is no presumptive in the Democratic Party right now. You can't turn around and say, oh, it's going to be Pete Buttigieg, it's going to be Josh Shapiro, it's going to be Gretchen Whitmer. Absent, parties are given force. Modern parties, which are quite weak by historical standards, modern parties tend to be given force by a centralizing personality. Donald Trump being a very strong example of that on the right, but Barack Obama was the person who held together the Democratic Party for a long time. In my lifetime, the Democratic Party has never been as internally fragmented and weak, leaderless, rudderless, as it is right now. Now, it won't stay that way. There's a rhythm to these things. There'll be a midterm. They're probably going to pick up a bunch of seats in the midterm. If that means Hakeem Jeffries becomes speaker after the midterm, he's going to have a much louder voice because he's going to have power. It's going to be a harder road for Schumer to get back to the majority because of the Senate map. And then we'll start having a primary on the left. And you'll begin to see voices emerge out of that. But right now, the Democratic Party, it doesn't have points of power. There's simply, outside of, at the national level, there is no Democrat who wields control over a branch of government. Right? They don't have the Supreme Court, they don't have the House, they don't have the Senate, they don't have the presidency, and they don't have a next in line. So you're looking at an organization without any of the people in a position to structure it. And the head of the DNC, the new head, Ken Martin, doesn't have power in that way. So it's they're pretty fractured.
You got a lot of criticism for this, but you were one of the people that early on said that Biden should step down. Why is the Democratic Party at this stage in its history so bad at generating the truly inspiring person? To me personally, AOC is an example of a person that might be that person.
You should have her on the show.
What?
I would watch that.
Definitely. But, I really try to, and we'll talk about this, I try to do like 2-3 hours, and there's a hesitancy on the left, especially to do these kinds of long programs. I think it's a trust issue. I'm not exactly sure what it is. 80% of the people on the show are left-wing. I'm pretty good faith, and I try to bring out the best in people.
Have you invited her? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens when people get closer to 2028.
Sure.
Maybe people begin taking that kind
I hope
of risk.
so. Bernie's up there in age, so he can't do it anymore. Why is the Democratic Party so bad at generating
I
this
don't
kind of
think
talent?
it's so bad at generating them. I think that it turned out to be bad at generating them this year. Look, as you mentioned, back in February 2023, I was somebody who came out and said, Biden can't run again. This isn't going to work. And my view, and that was really what that set of pieces was about the argument that even though Biden was clearly going to win the primary, there was still time for Democrats to do something the parties had done in the past and have an open convention. And you could structure the lead up to an open convention in a number of different ways, right? You could have something like a mini primary, but basically you'd have Democrats out in the media, out giving speeches, and their ultimate audience would be the delegates at the Democratic National Convention. And my hope was through that, you would find the person for this moment. The thing for Kamala Harris that was really difficult was she was for another moment. She was picked by Joe Biden in 2020 amidst just a very different political equilibrium, a sense that you had a transitionary moment between two versions of the Democratic Party. Maybe Joe Biden reaching a little bit back to the past, to these sort of lunch pail, blue-collar Democrats. Joe from Scranton was a big part of the Joe Biden appeal. But also, Biden never has a chance if he's not Barack Obama's vice president. And so you have this sort of weird set of historical factors operating at the same time. There's a desire for stability and experience amidst the chaos of Donald Trump and the pandemic. There is Biden as Obama's vice president, who nevertheless did not run in the election after Obama. I think a lot of people look back at 2016 and think, you know what, if Biden had been the candidate, he would have beaten Trump and we would live in a different reality. And then Biden chose Harris as an effort to shore up his own at least assumed weaknesses, right? He's a white man in the Democratic Party at a time when the Democratic Party is diversifying. And when the view of how you win elections is you put back together the Obama coalition. And the Obama coalition is young people, it's voters of color, and it's enough working class white voters and then college educated white voters, right? That's the Obama coalition.